Oline and salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. This talk is a direct follow-up to the one I recorded yesterday about what's not right in our world. I want to say, first of all, that I was moved by your responses to that talk. You realize, of course, that I'm walking close to the line here. Anything said today which appears to respect or endorse a certain ideology, a certain people, and the way they acted at a certain moment in history is borderline talk. So I'll continue to walk on this knife edge, and I'll tell you what I can, as clearly as I can, about how I see the importance of this truth. It occurred to me that I might modify the language slightly and talk about the right wind. It's a nautical expression. I use nautical expressions a lot, as you may know, and I based an entire 3-year program on a nautical metaphor, the Gaian navigation experiment. So it's a common expression. Sailors wait for the right wind to undertake their journey and to sail out of port. For a good many years now, a number of honest, truth-seeking, and well-intentioned people have pointed out that the left-right paradigm is a device of deception. You've heard the expression, perhaps, left and right in politics are the two wings of the same bird, and I totally agree with that observation. So I'll see if I can refrain from talking about the wing, and instead I'll talk about the wind. By the way, I'm putting these talks out with the designation PSA, Public Sanity Alert. So eventually, if I can remember to do it, they ought to be in a playlist under that designation. Someone in the comments posed a question, a really valid question. Well, aren't both far ends of the spectrum toxic? The short answer to that is certainly not. However, as long as the frame of interpretation is distorted by the false right-left paradigm, that is true. But in a larger picture, if you consider it more deeply and more broadly, it is not true. So I'm calling this talk Transparent Power, and I'm referring it to the mythological theme of the white horse of Kalki. Now, I've spoken before about Kalki. I did a talk entitled, Who is the Kalki Avatar? And in that talk, I referred to that myth, which comes from the Hindu-Indian tradition, and specifically, it's included in the master myth of the 10 avatars of Vishnu, to which I have often referred on many occasions. So, what is the white horse of Kalki and what is transparent power, if you accept those terms and those concepts as leading ideas going into this subject, I'm certain that you will come through it with a clear takeaway. And again, I repeat, as long as the deceptive paradigm of right and left-wing politics is operating, no clarity of that kind is possible. So it's a matter of actually shattering that paradigm and going to another one that reflects the actual truth of the situation. I would say that the two extreme ends of the spectrum of political ideology are not far right and far left. They are transparency and secrecy. So, could it be possible, could it ever happen that some kind of authoritarian structure, which is necessary to form a state from a nation of people, could be transparent? Obviously, what's working in the world today through politics and every other sphere of activity, education, finance, medicine, is not transparent. You see, that's the problem. The problem is the lack of transparency among those who are in positions of power and influence in society. Now, I invite you to contemplate for a moment, along with me, the image of the white horse. This is truly a mysterious and powerful mythological image. Why does it appear? It's a product of the imagination of our species. It has come from a particular race, the native peoples of the subcontinent of India, who are of an Aryan strain, the Aryan Caucasian races, and also including the dark-skinned or Dravidian races who inhabit that area, which is an area I know quite well from my travels in my youth. So I know both the northern and southern areas of India, and I've seen the peoples who inhabit those areas to this day. And I have great respect for the dark-skinned Dravidian peoples of the south. In fact, when I arrived in India, the strongest pull I felt immediately was to go south. And I did. And I walked a good part of the way. And I walked all the way from Bombay, or Mumbai as they call it today, where I landed in India for the first time, all the way down to Cape Comorin in a place called Nagercoil, which is at the extreme southern tip of the Indian subcontinent. And then I turned around and walked back up to Calcutta. So I do know something about the geographic and indigenous origins of this mythological image of Kalki. I've been to the land where that image emerged. So why is the horse of Kalki white? And why does it have no rider? In many representations it has a rider, but in others it doesn't. And if you go into the mythological material from the Puranas, which describe the avatars of Vishnu, I believe that in the earliest renditions. The White Horse of Kalki has no rider. And I've also spoken at length about this question: who is the rider? The identity of the rider is a kind of riddle. It's a riddle. And by looking at that riddle, many things can be learned and realized. You might have noticed that my book, The Hero, Manhood and Power, has the image of a white horse on the cover. It just turned out that way. I was in London researching in various libraries, such as the Courtauld, the illustrations for that book way back when, the late 90s. And I discussed with the designer at Thames and Hudson what would be the best cover. And I'm pleased with the cover that was chosen. You know, it's from the art of Mexico. The painter was Diego Rivera, who lived from 1886 to 1957. I believe that he sailed on the left wind. A very famous folk artist of that period who used his art for political purposes. He's often associated with the figure of Frida Kahlo. And that image is from a mural by Diego Rivera celebrating the Mexican Revolution, led by, who was it? Francisco Zapata. And it shows the simple peasant, Zapata, standing beside a white horse with no rider. So it's quite appropriate, more and more over time, that image was chosen for that book. That book, by the way, is out of print, and all the rights have been reverted to me by the publisher. So if I ever have the occasion to release it, I would make certain slight revisions in that book. It was written 25 years ago. That's a third of my life. And at that time, I didn't have the picture of how things sail on the right wind as I have it today. So there are certain slight allusions and value judgments in that book that I would revise if it were to come out again in a new edition. Not much, but some significant, small changes. So there's a riddle to contemplate here. First of all, why is the horse white? Well, I propose that white is a choice that has to be made to represent transparency. How could you depict or paint a transparent horse? That would be rather different. That's quite an artistic challenge, isn't it? So, if you consider, according to one theory of optics, that white is the ground of all the other colors, then in a certain respect, white makes itself invisible and transparent so that those other colors can appear, you see. And so I take white, in this case, as a metaphor for transparency. On the other hand, if you regard white as just that, as just white, well, obviously, the Kalki horse carries an allusion to the white races, which are, I must emphasize again, the minority on the planet in terms of global demographics. And it is, or certain powers would like it to be a hated and persecuted minority. Isn't that obvious? Now it comes to the riddle of the rider. Well, there's not just one rider. There's not just one Kalki Avatar. I've said this before. The Kalki Avatar is a self-elected role. Whoever mounts the horse is the Kalki Avatar, as long as the rider uses the power invested in him by the people and by the nation to act for the well-being and prosperity and preservation of the people. It's as simple as that. Now, I mentioned in the previous talk that it is not inconceivable that there could be an authoritarian power that is transparent and that acts for the good of the nation and the people. No, it's not inconceivable. Yet, the powers that be in the world today don't want anyone to believe that that would even be possible, that that could ever have happened. But it has happened. It has happened in one paramount instance, and it's also happened in other instances as well, in more recent historical memory. If you look at Libya and Gaddafi, if you look at Syria and Assad, you see a version. Nothing is perfect, and I'm not whitewashing anyone here. But you see a version, you see an attempt to realize this goal, this ideal of a benevolent authoritarian state. Now, I realize those words may come as shocking coming from me. Who, after all, am I, but the author who has attacked the authorities more strongly and frontally than anyone else in certain respects. Authorities and rulers is a translation of the word archons. So, Not in His Image exposes who the archons are in their alien and off-planet aspect, as well as who they are in their many shape-shifting guises in the world today. The leaders of the World Economic Forum, the technocrats, the globalist overlords, the humanitarians, the heads of humanitarian or so-called humanitarian organizations are all archontic authorities. So I've come out loud and clear against authority, haven't I? How then can I turn around and make any kind of case whatsoever for authoritarian power? Good question. To clarify that issue, I remind you of something that has been said about offense. Have you heard the expression? Offense can be taken, but it's not given. Offense is a very huge issue in the world today. It's a false and distorted issue. And many troubles and divisions in our society are due to the use of this concept of offense. So if I say something and you're offended, then you take offense at what I say, regardless of whether or not I intend to offend you. So offense is taken in that way, and that is true. And of course, people who take offense then put themselves in a position of authority against those whom they accuse of offending them. And this is a dirty, dirty game, which you see played everywhere across the planet today. But you could say something parallel about authority, but you have to change the language. authority, when it is taken, is wrong. But when it is given on the right terms, it can be right and necessary. So what happens with the creation of a state by a people living in a land who have an identity based on RPL, race, place, and language? What happens when a group of people in a country give authority to other people of that country to run their affairs? Well, this is something that happens inevitably in the organic development of human societies on this planet. I've drawn very deeply from the work of a Russian anthropologist named Lev Gumilev. It's very difficult to read Gumilev, but the takeaway, if you can manage it, is brilliant. Gumilev wrote a book called Ethnogenesis and the Biosphere. And in this book, he argued that ethnicities which inhabit certain regional areas of the world are organisms in the biosphere. They're actually organisms. Peoples living in countries united by language are living organisms in the superorganism of the earth. So Gumilev takes this brilliant organic approach to a question which is otherwise stated and argued in purely political terms. Ethnogenesis means the genesis, the birth and development of ethnicities. So ethnicities emerge in this great experiment on this planet as a natural outgrowth of the biosphere itself. Now, the analogy that I use in my attempt to understand what Gumilev said is the analogy of the human body with organs. The superorganism of Gaia has organs. And what are those organs? Well, they are the ethnic groups that emerge, the racial groups that emerge in different regions of the earth. So this is a natural process. And Gumilev brilliantly shows that. And where can you go with his thesis? Well, you go to the point where you can ask this question. When you look at the human body, you see that the various organs, the gallbladder, lungs, kidney, liver, and the brain, are all organized in the body according to certain sizes. They all have certain sizes. And if any of them gets larger than a particular size, which is the optimal size for all organs of the body to cooperate with each other, then something is wrong. So it begs the question, what is the largest size that an ethnogenetic organism can attain? Well, that's what you call a nation or a nation state. That's the optimal size. And when an ethnic group living in a certain region of the earth, be it Central Europe, the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, being the southern Mediterranean coast of Africa, where you have countries such as Algeria and Libya, you find that the nation state naturally develops at a certain point in the ethnogenesis of those peoples. And the nation state is a requirement for defining the boundaries of growth. The nation state appears when an ethnicity has to define itself. It achieves national identity. And national identity is not something merely political. If you follow the premise of Lev Gumilev, it is something organic. So the developments in recent history, fairly recent history, let's say, roughly speaking, coming forward from the year 1200, which is a significant year, history shows the emergence of these nation states, which are the identities of certain people, the identity of the ethnogenetic organism. Can you see that? And what is really interesting, and I've studied this really deeply, it's been one of my passions, is the question of how this happens. How does the, let's call it, the natural national identity of a people construct itself? It constructs itself by organic laws in the behavior and attitudes and values of those people. And when you look back in history, you find that in every case, the origins of this natural national identity go to heroic legends. For instance, El Cid was a hero of the Spanish peoples. And all of the cultures of Europe, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, Italy, everywhere, you find in their literature, in the pre-national period, there are heroic figures. And it was those heroic figures, in a way, who focalized the identity that eventually emerged as the sense of belonging to a nation. And this is absolutely natural that it would happen in this way. As Lev Gumilev illustrates, it's an organic development. It's ethnogenesis. Then what happens, of course, is that another type of organization of society comes into play, which is the state. The state that unifies the people of a nation and a land who share a common language. Language is a huge key in the development and direction and outcome of ethnogenesis. So it's a deep study, and you can learn a lot from investigating how the identity of the nation state emerged. And there were always national heroes involved. In some cases, if you go back in time, they were semi-legendary heroes. There are many of them in European history. If you go to South America and you find more recent developments, then you find historical heroes who become legendary, like Simón Bolívar of Bolivia, and there are many examples. Now, what is really interesting to consider is the initial conditions for the formation of a nation state. Who emerges from the people at that time and takes responsibility to lead the state, to lead the nation? This is where it gets really, really tricky, because obviously the quality of the character and the integrity of the men who undertake that mission determines the character of the nation state, whether it is actually honest and beneficial, and whether those who move into the positions of power and influence are doing so for the good of their people or not. And of course, politics has become entirely corrupt. To my mind, the word politician is synonymous with criminal and psychopath. Isn't that obvious by now? And so you see the problem here. But at the same time that we look at the problem, let's not lose sight of what might be called, not the ideal outcome, because nothing is ever ideal, but an outcome of a nation-state structure that is good enough to be true to the needs of the people. Good enough. Not perfect, but good enough. And how would you know? Where would you see the proof that it's good enough? Well, you would see it in the life of the people. Is their life improved? Do they have a social structure of political leadership that allows them to exercise all of their freedoms and to thrive and to collaborate together in mutual aid and to stand as a unified nation with a clear identity, like an organ of the body that can then relate to the other organs of the body, which are the other nation states of different peoples around the world. This is the organic picture that you can draw from Lev Gumilev, and of course I'm elaborating in my fashion. Now, I don't intend to go into an elaborate history lesson here, but I must point out how things went wrong and why they went wrong in this natural organic process of ethnogenesis. They started to go wrong in the 1700s. And in the late 1700s, going into the 1800s, history shows that there were many so-called revolutions, put that in quote. So there was the French Revolution, the American Revolution. In the 1840s and 50s, there were revolutions all over Europe, in almost every country. And of course, then later on, there was the worst revolution of all, which was not a revolution, and that was the Bolshevik takeover of the Tsarist regime in Russia. There was no Russian revolution led by the Russian people for their benefit. Go read Solzhenitsyn. Go read 200 Years Together to get that story. You can find it online. Although Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize, the publishers have never allowed that book, 200 Years Together, to be published so far. So what went wrong? What went wrong is that certain small factions of people were united by an evil motive to corrupt society and to hijack the genuine channels of power and influence that are delegated to the state by the people. You see, authority cannot be taken. When authority is taken, that's not right, and everything goes wrong. But when authority is given to the right people, then you get the best possible result, which is not perfect, but it's good enough. It's healthy enough to produce a healthy, strong nation with a solid identity and purpose. And that would be the ideal condition for the various organs of the body, of the planet. So the ideal paradigm, you could say, is a multinational world. A multinational world order, but not an international world order. But there was an attempt, there was a massive program beginning in the 1700s to establish an international world order, and you and I see that attempt culminating today in the globalist program of technocracy, one world order, and the Great Reset. How could it have been otherwise, you wonder? Well, there was an attempt to right the problem of this subversion of not democracy. No. In fact, democracy and liberal democracy are not what is subverted and corrupted and ruined. They are the point of the program and the agenda to subvert and ruin all nation states. Liberal democracy is the toxin. And you find that statement confirmed in what are called the protocols, certain protocols that appeared in the late 1700s, where it clearly states we will introduce liberalism as a toxin to undermine the nations. Couldn't be clearer than that. It's written in the agenda of those perpetrators who colluded in a massive conspiracy which has been running now for over 200 years with the intention that the nation states of the world and those people who are united in a national identity should never have their right way in this world. This program has been running, say, from around 1770 with the foundation of the Illuminati, who actually openly stated their protocols. And so 1870, 1970, it's going on 250 years, and it's now in its end game. So I guess I am giving a sort of history lesson here. Didn't really want to do that, but perhaps you find this background instructive. But let me bring it around the bend to the imperative case. Something happened in Central Europe around 1871 or 1872. And at that time, there was no such entity as the German nation. The region of Germany, united by the people who were born there, the natives, and their language and customs and history, consisted of, 20 or 30 different principalities. And someone came along around 1872 and united those groups into a nation. And after that, things took a really, really powerful turn. Because that particular nation grew really rapidly. And it so happened that the other nations in Europe at that time, such as France and England, saw that if they let it go its own way, if they let it take its right course, it would dominate them. But how would it dominate them? Well, not necessarily by a military program. No. It would dominate them by its creative and cultural achievements in every area you can imagine, in the natural sciences and in engineering and physics. Go look at the history. Who were the trailblazers and pioneers in the important areas of human culture coming forward from the middle of the 19th century? Go look at the names. What was the ethnicity of those trailblazers? And so it became obvious to certain factions within the French and English nations in particular, factions that were not themselves working for the benefit of those nations, but for their own benefit, third-party factions. It came to their attention. If they let the nation of Germany run its course, they were going to have a situation in Europe that would make it impossible for them to succeed in their plan of subversion leading to internationalism. And so they targeted that nation. And the first result was World War I. The second result was World War II. Now, without going further into these dense historical details, let's return to the identity of the rider. So if the white horse represents a government, state construct of transparent power, what assures that it is transparent? Well, you have to look again at the basic lie of liberal democracy. You hear again and again in the mainstream media that certain evil forces are destroying our democracy. It's a threat to our democracy. It's exactly the opposite. Liberal democracy is a threat to the benefit of all peoples. Liberal democracy is not the solution. And one of the big lies that keeps this deceit up and running, it's an intentional and evil deceit, is the statement that democracy is good because it's a system where the majority of people choose their leaders. So isn't that the bottom line of democracy? If you live in a democracy, you have the right to vote and you have the right to choose your leaders. Therein lies the fundamental deception. The way that a transparent power comes to take the form of a benevolent state, of a benevolent authority, is not by the people choosing the leaders. It's by the leaders choosing the people. And that is what made those developments in Germany from the year 1920 forward so extraordinary and exceptional in history. The men of that time who mounted the white horse of Kalki chose their people. And amazingly, if you look at the true record of what happened, the people chose them as well. So they were, the top political figures were democratically elected. That was not a fraud, as you saw in the recent election in the United States and in the elections anywhere in the world. The recent election in Canada. Can you believe that the Prime Minister of Canada, the son of Fidel Castro, was actually elected? No, the leaders are not elected. They haven't been elected for a long time. They're selected by that third party that is running all the nations to ruin and pitting them against each other and creating brother wars. So you see, the secret to the rider is that the rider chooses the people to lead. And why would the rider choose the people to lead? Or choose to lead the people in whatever country they may be in? The rider does it out of love and respect for the people. So the true authoritarian powers can be measured by that standard. You see them in the roles of power and control and the organization and direction of society. They're steering it and organizing it, and that function is necessary for any nation state when it reaches a certain level of growth and a certain size. So they are organizing and leading the large structures of society, but on what motive? The democratic lie says they have been chosen by the people to lead the people. But the truth is, it only works if the leaders choose the people out of love for the people, for the blood, the soil, and the language. That is the only way it can work correctly. And it's not a fantasy. It's not make-believe. It has happened. And it can happen again. Now, I'm not political. I don't put a political label on myself. But if you want to put one, you could call me an anarcho-socialist or an ethno-socialist. So I believe in the sovereign power of a people, a society, to create their own power structures that are beneficial to them. Now, it's all a matter of scale, of course. It's possible in a certain limit of population and in a certain limit of a region that there could be no state structure whatsoever. So in a certain region of a certain country, such as France or Spain today, it's possible that the people of that region could take responsibility to organize their affairs along the lines of anarcho-socialism or ethno-socialism. But in the larger growth of a nation, that's not possible. There has to be a rider. There have to be leaders and those who take responsibility for the infrastructure of society. It has to work that way because the people, the working class, and those who contribute to the maintenance of society dedicate their lives day to day to that mission. And they cannot be occupied with the organization, say, of the highways of a nation. Well, one of the first things that happened in the 30s in Germany was that the leaders who chose their people out of love and goodwill organized the highways. Have you ever seen them? They're still there. They're called autobahns. And when you go back and you read about how those highways were organized and how the workers were employed, the real 6 million figure is the 6 million unemployed in Germany who were employed in 3 years. And that event was so big that it reached the cover even of Time magazine. There has been no economic recovery in any nation of the world that can compare to that. Why not? Because it was orchestrated by leaders who chose the people, and the people, in recognition of the genuine will of the leaders, chose them in turn. That's as good as it gets. And it can be done again. And one of the statements that was made by the Schnauzer, who led that movement, needs to be restated today. He said clearly in his table talk, well, I don't intend to export National Socialism anywhere in the world. National Socialism is a unique construction for this people who speak this language and this nation. And it's a model. The benefit of the model is proven by the results of the model. And if other nations see this model of National Socialism and they want to adopt it, fine. But I have no intention of imposing it on anyone. That is what he actually said. Remember, I said you have to go back to what they said about themselves and their intentions, and not what has been said about them by others. That is a very clear statement. It doesn't get any clearer than that. Of course, that raises the question, well, why did that state in that particular time undertake a territorial imperative for Lebensraum, or living space. Did they not define and implement at that time a policy of expanding the territory of their nation to have Lebensraum, living space? Oh yes, they did. And when you look at the way they did it, you see that they did it in a completely honest and transparent fashion. They didn't create some pretext for what they did. They openly stated what they were doing and why. Now today, the internationalist cabal will tell you that that was evil and wrong. That was not right. But when has that not ever been done? That has been done all through history. There are territorial struggles between nations. This also is part of the ethnogenesis of the biosphere. And I'll just point out one fact to you again, one final historical fact. This talk, unfortunately, is overloaded with such facts. You hear about the aggression of Germany toward the east, right? Poland and the Ukraine. By the way, they also stated, I'm sure you've never heard this before, that the limit that they would go was the limit to which the beech trees grew. That was how they designated the limit to which they would go in their territorial aggression. So everyone knows about the condemnation of that act of territorial aggression. But do you know that in the late 1930s, the imperial nation of Japan invaded China? That's called the Sino-Japanese War, and it was already raging by the time that World War II began. And if you go look at a map, which you can find easily on the internet, of the extent of the territorial aggression of Japan into China, it absolutely dwarfs the extent of the territorial aggression intended by that regime. But you don't hear about that, do you? Have you ever heard today or recently the nation of Japan as it exists today condemned for its massive territorial aggression in China? Well, the Chinese certainly hate it, and they hate the Japanese for that. And in Japanese schools, the true history and facts about those events of the Sino-Japanese War are heavily censored. Nevertheless, let it not be forgotten that Japan joined the Axis powers, and there is a huge faction of the population of Japan today who looks upon Germany and the leadership of that time in a most approving fashion. So these are the facts of history. I didn't intend to go there so deeply, but let me say this to complete this talk. The only kind of power that can work in the right way for nations and in the continuation of ethnogenesis, including the question of territorial conflicts, which has always existed and which will always exist, the only right way for that to work out is by governments operating on transparent power. Freedom stands at the end of secrecy. The two ends of the spectrum are transparency and secrecy. And yes, it might come as a great surprise from yours truthfully, but there are forms of authoritarian power which are legitimate and necessary in this world. It all depends on the character and intention of who rides the white horse of Kalki. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.